I'll also add he has an excellent taste in cutting-edge science fiction. Maybe we can talk about that later on too. So, Jonathan Clarke, we look forward to your talk.
Thank you. Despite all that, I'm not sure if I can drive a Macintosh to get my presentation up. How do we get this thing running? No, wrong computer. We won't be using Macintoshes on Mars, let me tell you. It's on here? It's on.
It's on.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Most of you have had the experience when you've written abstracts of coming up with a title, burbling away for a paragraph or two, and then when you actually give the presentation, it looks only vaguely like it. Well, that's mine. Total depravity does come into it, but I actually came across this quote in a TV series called The Expanse from a character called Joe Miller. Are the stars better off without us? Which sums up some of the things that I want to say. And the subtitle is Popular Responses to the Final Frontier and Christian Engagement. Christian engagement is me. Again, the evils of me. Right. So, this is my own personal response to events on the space frontier, my own encounters and the encounters of others in investigating it, an observation of a rising misanthropic perception of what people are doing in space, and I raise the question is of what the Christian response to this should be, if there should be one, and look at the question of where we might go from here. And a big warning, pending asteroid impact size warning. This is a work in progress, so your feedback will be welcome and on where I take this. So, what sort of personal engagement on the space frontier are we talking about? What sort of stuff am I doing that gives me the right to stand up here and burble to you for 20 minutes? Well, I'm a space scientist. I'm particularly interested in planetary exploration, particularly Mars, studying Martian landscapes, Martian rocks that we've acquired with space probes, which is why I say I've worked on 2 planets. I'm also involved in analog research. It's just a fancy way of going places on Earth and which provide us insight into how the surfaces and the processes of other planets work, and studying them as a clue, as an analog for Martian or lunar or Venus-type environments. It also means doing simulation work that will help us develop the skills, the technology, the philosophies that will enable us to work on other planets. So here, this was me in August last year, working up on Devon Island, the Canadian Arctic, living in a tuna can for over a month, testing out approaches to living and working on Mars. I think I'm the guy number 5. I'm also interested in the area of space resources. Not that we're going to be putting in something like the superpit of Kalgoorlie on the surface of the moon, but rather using almost subsistence scale mining to help reduce the logistic overheads of living and working on other planets, the moon, Mars, and elsewhere. And other space operations as well. This is serious. For example, United Launch Alliance, a large American launch company, will pay, if I remember correctly, $3 million a ton for water in low Earth orbit. Doesn't matter whether that's brought from Earth, or brought from the moon, or from an asteroid. That's the price they're willing to pay for it to be delivered. And probably asteroids or a lunar source is the most likely way of providing that. And of course, all of us benefit and interact with the services of the space sector. If we flew here, if we drove here, we'd probably use GPS, we'd use satellite communications in the aircraft, we've relied on weather forecasting from Earth observation, and of course the various launch providers have put these assets into space. We're all embedded into a spacefaring culture. And of course this is the most grandiose example of the spacefaring culture, the International Space Station, collaborative effort of more than a dozen countries circling the world every 90 minutes or so. And you can see it many nights going overhead. And overall, this sort of thing is seen to be good. Unfortunately, I only have American data here. Australians haven't been surveyed, but 75% of Americans would like to see continued or increased funding for space activities. It seemed to be something that's socially good. If you get lost in the bush, you trigger your EPIRB and a helicopter comes and picks you up. Earth observation helps us predict hurricanes and bushfires, manage our environment better. We all are used to telecommunications via satellite, and of course the fantastic images from space telescopes such as Hubble. So 75% of Americans see it as being beneficial, and I suspect Australian data will be similar. And there's a link there to the source for that. However, that leaves the remaining 25%. And last year, I wrote a piece for the Conversation about my time in the Arctic, and some of the responses were really, in fact, a great deal of responses are quite interesting. Comment here that planning to go into space is all about raping, poisoning, and polluting what we find. Mars plans are a Ponzi scheme, which is basically a scam. Someone talked about the ethical flaws at the base of the fantasy, and to stay silent in these is inappropriate. Mars is without human blemish, and when Earthlings go there, we'll spoil it. Rubbishing other planets. We've got to repair the Earth first before we go elsewhere. This is a response to a simulation. This is not actually a response to people going to Mars. This is just a response to an article about the fun time I had in the Arctic doing a simulation. So if we actually went there, I mean, we'd probably get burnt at the stake. Planetary landscapes on that source of all truth, Facebook, is run by Nathy Cavold, who's a planetary scientist at the SETI Institute in California. There's over 1 million followers, and she put up a story about a little biosphere that China will land on the far side of the moon in December as part of the Chang'e 4 mission, which will put the first lunar rover on the lunar far side and indeed the first lander on the lunar far side. And this will be desecrating another body. Nowhere is safe from human beings. And it sort of goes on. You'd think engineers might be a little bit more sympathetic, but Engineers Australia, again on Facebook, they talked about the potential establishment of the Space Agency for Australia. We're currently one of only 2 OECD countries that doesn't have one. Infecting other worlds. These are engineers, right? Our ecosystem is taxes and mechanistic thinking of your people is so limited. Double FS. If you don't know what that is, ask me later. Space is just a wanker's dream. You can tell this is an Australian comment. Yeah, very incoherent comment about gathering Mars dust and what good's that. The Conversation, again, my former colleague Andy Glickson wrote one about people wanting to settle Mars, the ethical polarity between those going to conquering space and those defending Earth and global warming. And he talked about it'd be far better to spend money to stop climate change than to explore space, or to settle space, I should say. And another piece by him, sort of, if you want to talk about living on other planets, you're ignoring scorched Earth to fulfill your dreams. And this, I think he said bozo, this character here talked about the lack of social responsibility, and in fact we should wind up astronomy now, along with many other industries, until everyone on Earth is fed. So, all your astronomers, you're not safe either. And the common themes here are environmental protection and repair of the Earth is more important than exploring space, working in space. We should spend money on the poor. Despoilation of the alien environment is inevitable. Going to space will speed up destruction of Earth. It's a front for militarism. It's a scam. A lot of these arguments are quite incoherent. Okay, precursor research, space exploration does not necessarily equal resource extraction or settlement. Confusion of scale. Human activities in one area, be it a little robotic probe or a small research facility, doesn't mean to say we're wrecking the entire planet. Spacefaring is unethical, morally problematic, etc. Also, there is religious language, right? Desecration. I actually asked that person what they meant by the moon being desecrated by a little biosphere is probably the size of a large Milo tin, and they didn't get back to me on that. Humanity and disease will infect and blight other planets. It's the place of, it's a province of unjust privilege. You know, if you want to go to space, you're one of the privileged few. Well, yes, you are, but not privileged as perhaps as they meet it. And there's even the language of sexual violence, rape. So, quote from the great philosopher in The Matrix, human beings are a disease, a cancer of this planet. And even in science fiction, we find the same dystopian and misanthropic views of spacefaring futures, increasingly. I was in the middle of a 3-month Mars simulation, and we saw the National Geographic future documentary of living on Mars, and to be perfectly honest, if I thought it was anything like that, I wouldn't have been in the simulation. I mean, the brilliant series, The Expanse, has that line in it from several characters that the other stars are better off without us because of the basic problems of humanity. And even Star Trek, you know, supposedly the epitome of optimistic views of the future, now has titles like Into Darkness. So, really, this view, which represents perhaps 25%, roughly 25% of people thinking about space, not necessarily coherently, but thinking in some sense, combines a sense of total depravity. You know, human beings are so bad we shouldn't go anywhere else. But there's no sense of grace. Not necessarily theological grace, but the common grace that says, yes, we can work at problems, we are flawed, we can nonetheless work towards a more just future, a more equitable future, and a more glorious future, doing amazing things. And I think to even have that, there has to be a secular recognition, at least, of common grace. Again, not necessarily in theological terms, but optimism about what's happening in the world is something that God sends on the just and the unjust alike. So this comes into where we arrive. Is there a Christian perspective on this? It's hard to say. There's actually more books written by Christians on the search for extraterrestrial life and what we are to make of them theologically should we ever find them, or extraterrestrial intelligence, I should say, than there is about the practical realities of living and working and exploring space, which is happening now. It's a yawning gap in the Christian literature. You know, there's hundreds of thousands of people who actually work in the space sector, directly and indirectly, perhaps millions. You know, we have these enormous insights into the nature of the universe from space exploration. I raised the possibility that when we talk about caring for creation, and some people will be doing this at the conference, we must be aware that creation care isn't just about the Earth. We are already working on a larger stage. You know, as I speak, there are probes orbiting Mercury, Venus, Mars, the Moon. There are probes operating on the surface of Mars, the Moon. There are probes out beyond the solar system, orbiting Jupiter. We have communication satellites and a whole range of other application satellites that provide much of the basis of our civilization that we take for granted. So, how do we work this larger stage into our understanding of the role and destiny of creation, God's world, our place in it, redemption? That's something, as I said, it's a work in progress. Our view of technology must include the solar system. both the scope of that technology and the wise application of it. Extraterrestrial resources. Recognising, of course, as humans, we do tend to abuse what we do. So we need an application of just frameworks. What does that mean in terms of space debris or allocation of increasingly scarce orbital slots for communication satellites? And it's ironic that perhaps the most detailed exploration to date was by C.S. Lewis on some of these questions, and they're over 50 years old. Basically before the space age. He wrote a couple of things in the very early 60s where people Yuri Gagarin had already been in space with Sputnik and the first lunar probes. This time perhaps we revisited these issues. Where do we go from here? Well, there's a challenge here for the space sector. Right? Industry, government, academic, and the popular sectors, who are by and large poorly equipped to handle moral arguments. I mean, I engage the public on Facebook in various online fora, and really they haven't got any more of a clue than the average person we meet in the street. I mean, cue engineer and scientist stereotypes, perhaps. There is a tendency to technological triumphalism, the idea that, oh yes, well, you know, human destiny is to go forth and conquer. These are some of the issues that Lewis was concerned about. But there's also the questions I've raised already about what future developments will be impeded through a misanthropic view of humanity. Through a poor, incoherent understanding and opposition. The consequences perhaps of losing out on better technological, environmental management with space technology. Weather data, environmental data from satellites is absolutely critical in every part of our lives, even though we don't realise it. And the failure to gain new visions. They expand human culture, our awareness through fear and self-loathing. I mean, the image earlier, the COSAC image of the Hubble Space Telescope, the deep field. Without a space telescope, you wouldn't have that. Where would we be without the image from Apollo 8 of the Earth from lunar orbit? Perhaps the most reproduced image, photographic image in Earth history. So my conclusions, yes, there's a lack of Christian reflection on actual spacefaring. I mean, it's interesting to speculate about SETI, but let's focus on what we're actually doing now and what's going to happen in the next few decades. There is a rise of a misanthropic attitude. How do we respond as Christians to secular acceptance of total depravity without grace? Not just in spacefaring, but in environmental management, in forest management, for example. And the consequent rejection of a possibility of redemption. We have a need to develop a theological framework of spacefaring. Extension principles that already exist. There is an outer space treaty which has proved very successful in, despite certain limitations, in framing how people work in space. You need to recognise in the next 20 years there'll be most probably increased spacefaring by more countries than ever. Right, where countries like Thailand and Nigeria run satellites, when the largest Earth observation constellation is owned by, civil Earth observation constellation is owned by India, these spacefaring and application of space data isn't going to go away. There's going to be increased space commercialization, including perhaps purely commercial space exploration. Not government run, but run by companies with commercial aims. And we continue going to explore space scientifically. In a few weeks, there's another probe going to Mars. End of this year, there's going to be at least 2 lunar probes, and every year, more space science missions. 2019, there's a successor to the Hubble Space Telescope, the James Webb Telescope, will be going into orbit. And the question, the challenge for us is, what role will Christians have in the framing of these developments? Okay. While spacefaring is generally supported, deep hostility Often this hostility is linked to environmental and misanthropic sentiments. Little discussion of the moral dimension, even though it's so important, and there is an opportunity for us here. Questions? Yeah.
What were the references for C.S. Lewis? Which books?
There are 2 short published essays. They sometimes have different titles. One is called Religion and Rocketry. I think the other one was called Will We Find God in Outer Space. There's also an interview he did for an American magazine only a short time before his death. There is also, of course, 2 of his 3 so-called Space Trilogy books have some reflections there. They were written about 20 years earlier, so somewhat different perspective in some respects, and that needs to be taken into account. There's also a very funny conversation he had with a group of science fiction writers over understanding science fiction as a literary form. As a transcript of a conversation over brandy and cigars. It's very hard to find. There's also a series of correspondence between Lewis and Arthur C. Clarke, which has some interesting insights as well. Yeah.